The sound of metal scraping against metal pierced the afternoon quiet as I watched through my front window. Karen stood on my porch, her face twisted in concentration as she jammed what looked like a house key into my deadbolt. The key turned halfway, then stopped. She pulled it out, examined it like it had personally betrayed her, then shoved it back in with more force. The lock mechanism groaned under the pressure, but it held firm. I had been expecting this moment for weeks. From my position in the hallway, I could see her growing frustration as she rattled the door handle with increasing aggression. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was starting to frizz in the humidity, and sweat beads formed on her forehead despite the mild weather. She tried the key again, this time wiggling it back and forth while simultaneously pulling and pushing on the door handle. When the lock refused to budge for the fifth time, Karen stepped back from the door and pulled out her cell phone. Her voice carried clearly through the thin spring air as she dialed 911, her tone shifting instantly to one of manufactured panic and authority. "Yes, this is Karen Mitchell, president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association," she announced into the phone, her voice rising with each word. "I need police assistance immediately at 427 Maple Street. I have a tenant who is refusing lawful access to the property for a mandatory HOA inspection. He has changed the locks without authorization and is preventing me from entering with my master key." I smiled to myself as I lifted my own phone to my ear. The call had already connected, and a familiar voice greeted me on the other end. "Hey there, Marcus," came the calm professional tone of Dispatcher Williams. "Right on schedule, just like you predicted. She is currently on line 2, claiming you are some kind of squatter, refusing her access. Should I patch you through so you can hear her story, or do you want me to handle this the usual way?" "The usual way sounds perfect, Janet," I replied quietly, keeping my voice low so Karen would not hear me through the door. "I have got all the documentation ready, and my security camera caught the whole attempted break-in. How long until the officers arrive?" "Unit 12 is about 3 minutes out. They are already briefed on the situation, and Officer Rodriguez has your complaint file from last month. This should be interesting." I had moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood 6 months earlier, drawn by the tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes. The house was a modest 2-bedroom ranch with a small front yard and a garden that the previous owner had clearly loved. Everything seemed perfect until I met Karen Mitchell during my second week in the neighborhood. She had appeared at my front door on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand and wearing a bright yellow blazer that seemed to announce her self-importance to the world. Karen was probably in her late 40s, with a kind of aggressively maintained appearance that spoke of someone who had too much time and not enough real responsibilities. Her makeup was applied with military precision, and her jewelry caught the sunlight in a way that seemed calculated to blind anyone who disagreed with her. "Welcome to Willowbrook," she had said, though her smile never reached her eyes. "I am Karen Mitchell, your HOA president. I need to conduct a preliminary inspection of your property to ensure everything meets our community standards before you get too settled in." When I politely declined and explained that I had already reviewed the HOA guidelines and made sure everything was in compliance, her demeanor shifted noticeably. The fake smile disappeared, and her grip on the clipboard tightened until her knuckles went white. "I am afraid you do not understand," she had said, her voice taking on the tone of someone speaking to a particularly slow child. "This is not optional. As HOA president, I have master key access to every property in this neighborhood for emergency inspections and compliance checks. It is clearly outlined in Section 4.7 of your homeowner agreement." I had read that agreement thoroughly before purchasing the house, and there was no such provision. When I pointed this out, Karen became visibly agitated, insisting that the agreement had been recently updated and that all residents were required to provide access upon request. She claimed to have a master key that worked on every lock in the development, provided by the builder for safety purposes. That night, I spent 3 hours reading through every page of HOA documentation, neighborhood covenants, and local housing laws. There was absolutely nothing that gave Karen or anyone else the right to demand entry into my home. The HOA had the authority to inspect visible exterior elements like lawn maintenance, paint color, and mailbox style. But they had no jurisdiction over the interior of any residence. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed. The old locks were standard builder-grade hardware that could easily be master keyed, but the new deadbolts were high-security models with restricted key duplication. I also installed a video doorbell system that would record any activity on my front porch. Karen returned 3 days later, this time accompanied by 2 other neighborhood residents who she introduced as her HOA board members. She tried her key in the new lock, and when it did not work, she demanded that I provide her with a copy immediately. When I refused, she threatened to fine me for unauthorized lock changes and promised that I would be hearing from their lawyer. I filed a formal complaint with the local police department the next day, documenting Karen's harassment and her false claims about having legal access to my property. Officer Rodriguez took my statement and explained that what Karen was attempting could potentially be classified as attempted breaking and entering, depending on her actions and intent. "We have had calls about this woman before," Officer Rodriguez had told me confidentially. "She seems to think being HOA president gives her some kind of police powers. It does not. Your home is your castle, and nobody has the right to demand entry without proper legal authority." Over the following weeks, Karen escalated her campaign against me. She left passive-aggressive notes on my door about various manufactured violations. One day, it was my garden gnome, which she claimed violated the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The next day, it was my porch light, which she insisted was the wrong color temperature and created light pollution. I researched every single complaint she made, and none of them were legitimate. The HOA covenants made no mention of garden decorations under a certain size, and there were no specifications about porch lighting beyond basic safety requirements. Karen was making up rules as she went along, apparently hoping I would become frustrated enough to either give in to her demands or move away entirely. The harassment intensified when I refused to engage with her increasingly ridiculous complaints. She began pounding on my door at odd hours, claiming there were emergency situations that required immediate inspection. One evening, she insisted there was a gas leak that she needed to investigate personally. Another time, she claimed there were structural violations that posed a danger to neighboring properties. Each incident was recorded by my security system, and I dutifully filed reports with the police department. The officers who responded were always professional, but I could tell they were getting tired of dealing with Karen's antics. She had a way of presenting herself as the reasonable authority figure, while making me seem like the difficult resident who was refusing to cooperate with legitimate community standards. But I had done my homework. I knew exactly what rights I had as a homeowner, and I knew that Karen had absolutely no legal authority to enter my property for any reason. More importantly, I had started to suspect that her supposed master key was not as official as she claimed it to be. A conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, confirmed my suspicions. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, and she told me that there had never been any master key system in the development. The builder had gone out of business shortly after the last houses were completed, and there was no property management company that maintained universal access. Karen just started claiming she had those keys about 2 years ago, Mrs. Peterson explained as we chatted over the fence between our yards, right around the time she got elected HOA president. She had some locksmith friend make keys that worked on the old builder locks, and then she started calling them master keys. Most people just went along with it because they figured she must know what she was talking about. That information was the final piece of the puzzle I needed. Karen was not just overstepping her authority as HOA president. She was actively engaged in a fraudulent scheme to gain unauthorized access to people's homes. The master key story was a complete fabrication designed to intimidate residents into compliance. I began documenting everything more carefully, keeping detailed records of every interaction with Karen and every false claim she made. I also reached out to other neighbors who had dealt with her so-called inspections, and the stories I heard were alarming. Karen had entered several homes when residents were away, claiming emergency authority. She had gone through people's personal belongings, taken photographs of interior spaces, and even left threatening notes about violations she claimed to have discovered. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring. I was working from home when I noticed Karen's car parked across the street from my house. She sat in the driver's seat for nearly an hour, periodically taking photographs of my property with a telephoto lens. When she finally got out of the car, she walked slowly around the perimeter of my yard, taking notes on her ever-present clipboard. I called the police non-emergency line and spoke directly to Officer Rodriguez, explaining the situation and asking for advice. He suggested that I also contact the emergency dispatch center and provide them with a heads up about Karen's escalating behavior. If she is planning something big, she will probably try to make it look like an emergency situation, Officer Rodriguez explained. The dispatch center should know your situation so they can handle any calls appropriately. I called the dispatch center that afternoon and spoke with Dispatcher Williams, a veteran operator who had been handling emergency calls in our area for over a decade. She listened carefully as I explained the situation with Karen and her fake master key claims. We have dealt with this woman before, Dispatcher Williams told me. She has called 911 at least 6 times in the past year, reporting various neighborhood emergencies that turned out to be completely fabricated. We flagged her number after she reported a house fire that was actually just someone using their fireplace. I provided Dispatcher Williams with my contact information and asked her to call me directly if Karen tried to report any kind of emergency at my address. We worked out a simple system where I would answer my phone with a code phrase that would let her know I was safe and that any emergency Karen reported was likely fabricated. 2 days later, Karen made her move. I watched from my window as she approached my front door with more confidence than usual. Instead of her typical clipboard, she carried what looked like an official-looking folder and her cell phone. She walked straight to my door and tried her key in the lock, but of course it did not work because I had changed all the locks months earlier. What happened next was exactly what I had been expecting, but it was still surreal to watch unfold in real time. Karen stepped back from the door, dialed 911, and launched into her fabricated emergency report about a squatter refusing lawful access to the property. As soon as I heard her making the call, I dialed the dispatch center. Dispatcher Williams answered immediately and confirmed that Karen was on another line making a false report. The system we had worked out functioned perfectly, and within minutes I had provided my verification code and confirmed that there was no emergency at my address. Officers are on their way anyway, Dispatcher Williams explained. Karen is being very insistent, and we need to respond to all calls. But they know the real situation, and they have instructions to contact you directly when they arrive. I spent the next few minutes gathering the documentation I had prepared for exactly this scenario. I had copies of my property deed, mortgage documents, and HOA agreements. I had photographs of Karen trying to enter my property without permission. Most importantly, I had video evidence from my security system showing her attempting to use her fake master key and then making false statements to emergency services. Officer Rodriguez arrived first, followed closely by his partner, Officer Thompson. I watched from my window as they approached Karen, who was still standing on my front porch, looking agitated and self-righteous. She immediately launched into her prepared speech about being the HOA president with legitimate authority to inspect my property. I opened my front door before the officers had a chance to knock, which seemed to surprise Karen considerably. She had probably expected to continue her performance about being locked out by an uncooperative tenant. "Good afternoon, officers," I said calmly, stepping out onto my porch with my folder of documentation. "I believe Dispatcher Williams already briefed you on the situation, but I have all the relevant paperwork here if you need to review anything." Officer Rodriguez nodded professionally and glanced at Karen, whose confident demeanor was already starting to crack. "Ma'am, we are going to need to see some identification and documentation of your claimed authority to access this property." Karen fumbled in her purse for her driver's license, while simultaneously trying to maintain her authority figure persona. "This is ridiculous," she declared, her voice rising to the pitch she used when she felt her power being challenged. "I am the HOA president, and I have every right to conduct inspections. This man has been refusing lawful access for months." Officer Thompson stepped forward and examined the key Karen was still clutching in her hand. "Ma'am, can you explain where you obtained this key and what specific legal authority gives you the right to enter someone else's home without their permission?" The question clearly caught Karen off guard. She had probably never been challenged by actual law enforcement officers before, and her usual intimidation tactics were not working. She started stammering about builder-provided master keys and HOA emergency powers, but her explanations became increasingly incoherent as the officers pressed for specific details. Meanwhile, I calmly handed Officer Rodriguez my documentation folder. Inside were copies of all the relevant legal documents, photographs of Karen's previous attempts to gain entry, and printouts of the video footage from my security system. I also included a written statement detailing the months of harassment and false claims. As you can see, I explained quietly, there is no legal provision that gives the HOA or anyone else the right to enter my home without permission. Ms. Mitchell has been attempting to gain unauthorized access for months, and today she escalated to filing a false police report when her fake master key did not work. Officer Rodriguez reviewed the documents carefully, while Officer Thompson continued questioning Karen about her claimed authority. It became increasingly clear that Karen had no legitimate legal basis for her actions, and her story about master keys provided by the builder was falling apart under scrutiny. "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said firmly, "attempting to enter someone's home without their permission is trespassing, regardless of any claimed HOA authority. Filing false reports with emergency services is also a serious offense. You need to step away from this property immediately and cease any attempts to gain unauthorized access." Karen's face went through several color changes as the reality of her situation became clear. The officers were not buying her story, and her supposed authority as HOA president meant nothing in the face of actual law enforcement. She tried one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the situation. "You do not understand," she insisted, her voice becoming shrill. "I have documentation from the HOA board authorizing these inspections. This man is in violation of multiple community standards, and I have photographic evidence of his non-compliance." Officer Rodriguez looked up from my paperwork with a skeptical expression. "Ma'am, I have reviewed all the relevant HOA documents, and there is no provision for interior inspections or master key access. Even if there were, HOA covenants cannot override state and federal laws regarding residential privacy and property rights." The moment when Karen realized she had been completely outmaneuvered was visible on her face. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and the aggressive confidence that had sustained her for months seemed to deflate all at once. She looked around desperately, probably hoping to see supportive neighbors who would back up her claims. But the few people who had come out to watch the commotion were keeping their distance. Officer Thompson pulled out his notepad and began documenting the incident officially. "Ma'am, I am going to need to confiscate this key as evidence, and you will be receiving a formal warning about filing false police reports. If there are any further incidents of harassment or attempted unauthorized entry, you will be facing criminal charges." Karen tried to protest as Officer Thompson took her fake master key, but her objections sounded weak and desperate. The key that had been the symbol of her imagined authority was now evidence of her attempted crimes. "This is not over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The HOA board will be hearing about this, and there will be consequences for refusing lawful inspections." I almost felt sorry for her in that moment. Karen had built her entire neighborhood identity around being the person in charge, the authority figure who could demand compliance from everyone around her. Having that illusion shattered so publicly and completely must have been devastating for someone whose self-worth was tied so closely to controlling others. But my sympathy was limited. Karen had harassed me and my neighbors for months with her fake authority and fraudulent master key scheme. She had violated people's privacy, invaded their homes, and used intimidation tactics to get her way. The consequences she was facing were entirely of her own making. Officer Rodriguez handed me back my documentation folder and nodded approvingly. "You handled this situation very professionally, sir. Your documentation and preparation made our job much easier. If Miss Mitchell attempts to contact you or access your property again, please call us immediately." As the officers prepared to leave, Karen made one final attempt to salvage her dignity. She straightened her blazer, lifted her chin, and tried to project the same commanding presence she had used to intimidate people for so long. "This is far from over," she declared, looking directly at me with what she probably thought was a menacing stare. "You have made a very powerful enemy today, and the HOA board will make sure you regret interfering with official business." Officer Thompson turned back toward Karen with a stern expression. "Ma'am, that statement could be interpreted as a threat. I strongly suggest you limit any future contact with this gentleman to written HOA communications that are actually authorized by your organization's legitimate authority." Any further harassment will result in criminal charges. The warning seemed to finally get through to Karen. She deflated visibly and mumbled something about consulting with HOA attorneys before walking back to her car. I watched as she drove away, noting that she seemed to be slumped over the steering wheel in defeat. The aftermath of Karen's failed master key gambit spread through the neighborhood faster than I had expected. Within a week, I was contacted by 3 other residents who wanted to share their own stories about Karen's unauthorized inspections and fraudulent master key claims. Mrs. Chen from 2 blocks over had been out of town when Karen let herself into her house, claiming there was a water leak emergency. No leak was ever found, but Karen had gone through Mrs. Chen's personal belongings and left a list of supposed HOA violations, including complaints about furniture placement and interior paint colors that were not even visible from outside the house. Mr. Garcia had similar experiences with Karen entering his home while he was at work, claiming authority to inspect for electrical code violations. She had taken photographs of his home office setup and threatened to fine him for running a business from his residence, even though he was just working remotely for his employer like millions of other people. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Karen had been using her fake master key to commit what amounted to serial breaking and entering, justified by fabricated HOA authorities that existed only in her imagination. She had been violating people's privacy and security for months, and most residents had been too intimidated or confused to challenge her claims. I decided it was time to take action beyond just protecting my own property. I organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss Karen's abuses and to educate residents about their actual rights regarding HOA inspections and property access. The meeting was held at the community center on a Thursday evening, and over 30 residents attended. Many people shared stories similar to those I had already heard, and it became clear that Karen's fraudulent master key scheme had affected a significant portion of the neighborhood. We collectively decided to file a formal complaint against Karen with the HOA board itself, demanding her removal from office and a complete review of all policies regarding property inspections. We also contacted an attorney who specialized in homeowner association law to ensure our rights were properly protected. The HOA board meeting the following month was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Instead of the usual handful of residents discussing mundane maintenance issues, over 50 people packed the community center meeting room. Karen sat at the front table looking pale and nervous, surrounded by the other board members who seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting progressed. When it came time for public comments, resident after resident stood up to detail Karen's unauthorized entries and fraudulent master key claims. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Karen had systematically violated the privacy and security of dozens of homes, using fabricated authority to justify what amounted to criminal behavior. Karen tried to defend herself by claiming that her actions were necessary to maintain community standards and that she had been operating under advice from HOA attorneys. But when pressed for documentation of this legal advice, she could produce nothing. Her claims about builder-provided master keys were also thoroughly debunked when several residents contacted the original construction company and confirmed that no such system had ever existed. The board vote was unanimous. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president immediately, and all policies regarding property inspections were suspended pending a complete legal review. The fake master keys were to be surrendered to the police, and Karen was banned from serving in any HOA leadership role in the future. But the consequences for Karen extended beyond just losing her position on the HOA board. Word of her fraudulent master key scheme spread throughout the broader community, and her reputation as a trustworthy authority figure was completely destroyed. Several residents indicated they were considering pursuing civil lawsuits for privacy violations and unlawful entry. The local police department also opened a formal investigation into Karen's activities, based on the evidence collected from multiple victims. While she had not technically broken and entered in the traditional sense, her use of fraudulent keys to gain unauthorized access to occupied residences potentially constituted multiple felony offenses. As for me, the victory felt satisfying but not particularly surprising. I had always known that Karen's master key claims were fraudulent, and I had prepared carefully for the eventual confrontation. What did surprise me was how many other residents had been victimized by her scheme and how grateful they were that someone had finally stood up to her intimidation tactics. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency vote the following month, implemented strict policies regarding property access and inspection authority. All future inspections would be limited to visible exterior elements only, and any requests for interior access would require proper legal documentation and homeowner consent. I was asked to serve on the new board myself, but I declined the position. My goal had never been to gain power or control over the neighborhood. I simply wanted to live peacefully in my own home without harassment from fake authority figures with fraudulent master keys. The final chapter of the Karen Master Key saga came 3 months later when I received a call from Officer Rodriguez. Karen had been formally charged with multiple counts of unlawful entry and filing false police reports. The investigation had uncovered evidence that she had been running her fraudulent master key scheme for over 2 years, affecting dozens of properties throughout the area. Your documentation and preparation made this case much stronger, Officer Rodriguez told me. Without the video evidence and detailed records you kept, it would have been much harder to prove the pattern of fraudulent behavior. Karen ultimately pled guilty to reduced charges and received probation along with community service requirements. She was also required to pay restitution to residents whose privacy she had violated, and she moved out of the neighborhood entirely within 6 months of her conviction. The house across the street, where Karen used to live, was purchased by a young family with 2 small children. They introduced themselves shortly after moving in and mentioned that they had heard about the previous drama with the HOA president and her fake master keys. We actually chose this neighborhood partly because we heard that residents here successfully stood up to an abusive HOA board, the new neighbor told me. It shows this is a community where people look out for each other and do not let bullies take advantage of their neighbors. I reflected on that comment as I watched their children playing in the front yard where Karen used to park her car to spy on my house. The neighborhood felt different now, more relaxed and genuinely friendly. People were no longer afraid of arbitrary inspections and manufactured violations from a power-hungry HOA president with fraudulent authority. The master key that Karen had used to intimidate and control residents for years turned out to be nothing more than a piece of metal with no legitimate authority behind it. But the real key to resolving the situation had been preparation, documentation, and a willingness to stand up for basic property rights in the face of fraudulent claims. Karen's downfall was ultimately the result of her own arrogance and overreach. If she had been content with the legitimate authority that came with being HOA president, she might have continued in that role for years. But her need to control and intimidate others led her to fabricate powers she did not have and claim authority she had never been granted. The fake master key was the perfect symbol of Karen's fraudulent approach to neighborhood leadership. It looked official and intimidating, but it had no real power behind it. When challenged by someone who understood the law and was prepared to defend their rights, the whole scheme collapsed like the house of cards it had always been. 3 weeks after Karen's conviction, I received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Henderson from Pine Street knocked on my door one Tuesday morning, carrying a manila envelope and looking nervous. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, and I had rarely seen her interact with other residents. "I hope you do not mind the intrusion," she said apologetically, "but I have something I think you should see. It is about Karen and her master key situation, and I am not sure what to do with this information." Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents that Mrs. Henderson had apparently been keeping for several years. The papers included correspondence between Karen and a locksmith named Tony's Security Services, along with receipts for key duplication and lock installation work throughout the neighborhood. "Karen approached me about 3 years ago," Mrs. Henderson explained as we sat in my living room reviewing the documents. "She claimed the HOA board had voted to implement a master key system for emergency access, and she needed my permission to have my locks changed to accommodate the new keys." The paperwork told a disturbing story that went far beyond what I had previously understood about Karen's scheme. She had not simply been using fake master keys on existing locks. She had been systematically arranging to have residence locks replaced with hardware that would accept her fraudulent master keys. According to the receipts, Karen had convinced at least 15 homeowners to allow lock replacements over a 2-year period. She had presented each resident with official-looking HOA documentation authorizing the work, and she had arranged for Tony's Security Services to perform the installations at no cost to the homeowners. The expenses were supposedly being covered by HOA, emergency preparedness funds. I was suspicious from the beginning, Mrs. Henderson continued, because I had never heard the HOA board discuss any master key system in their meetings. But Karen was very convincing, and she had all these official-looking papers. She said it was for everyone's safety in case of medical emergencies or natural disasters. The documentation revealed that Karen had been running a much more sophisticated operation than anyone had realized. She had created fake HOA board meeting minutes authorizing the master key system, complete with forged signatures from other board members. She had also produced fraudulent budget allocations showing how the lock replacement costs would be covered by association funds. Most disturbing of all, the locksmith receipts showed that Tony's security services had been creating multiple copies of each master key. Karen had not just been giving herself access to people's homes, she had been creating a whole set of duplicate keys that could potentially be distributed to others. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked Mrs. Henderson, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because Tony came to my house last week," she replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "He wanted to know if the police had contacted me about the master key investigation. When I told him no, he seemed very relieved. Then he offered to buy back all the documentation I had about Karen's lock replacement program. The implications were staggering. Tony's security services had been a willing participant in Karen's fraudulent scheme, and now they were apparently trying to cover their tracks by retrieving evidence of their involvement. The locksmith company had knowingly participated in what amounted to a conspiracy to gain unauthorized access to dozens of private residences. I immediately contacted Officer Rodriguez and arranged to turn over Mrs. Henderson's documentation to the police investigation. The new evidence expanded the scope of the case significantly and potentially implicated Tony's security services in multiple felony crimes. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Karen's master key conspiracy. Police discovered that she had been working with Tony's security services for over 3 years, systematically targeting new residents who were unfamiliar with HOA procedures and neighborhood norms. The locksmith company had been splitting the profits with Karen from unnecessary lock replacement services, while also providing her with master key access to the modified locks. Even more troubling, the investigation uncovered evidence that Karen had been selling copies of her master keys to other people outside the neighborhood. A search of her home revealed correspondence with private investigators, debt collectors, and even some individuals with criminal backgrounds who had purchased key copies for purposes that were never clearly explained. The revelation that Karen's master key scheme had extended far beyond simple HOA power trips sent shockwaves through the entire community. Residents realized that their home's security had been compromised not just by one power-hungry neighbor, but by an organized criminal operation that had been selling access to their properties to unknown third parties. Emergency locksmith services were called in to replace locks throughout the neighborhood, this time with proper documentation and homeowner consent. The HOA Association voted to cover the costs of the lock replacements, using funds that had been earmarked for Karen's fraudulent master key program. Tony's security services was shut down pending criminal investigation, and the owner faced multiple felony charges related to conspiracy, fraud, and unlawful entry. The case became a cautionary tale that was covered by local news outlets and used by law enforcement agencies to educate other communities about similar scams. Karen's sentencing was delayed pending the expanded investigation, but the additional charges she faced virtually guaranteed that her punishment would be more severe than the original probation agreement. Her cooperation with the investigation into Tony's security services became her only hope for avoiding significant prison time. The final irony of the entire situation was that Karen's obsession with having master key access to everyone's homes had ultimately resulted in her losing access to her own home. Unable to afford her legal expenses and facing multiple lawsuits from victimized residents, she was forced to sell her house and move in with relatives in another state. The new owners of Karen's former home were a retired couple from the East Coast who had heard about the neighborhood's reputation for successfully dealing with HOA corruption. They specifically chose the area because they wanted to live in a community where residents looked out for each other and refused to tolerate abuse from local authority figures. "We have dealt with our share of power-hungry HOA presidents over the years," the new neighbor told me as we chatted over the fence. But we have never heard of anyone taking it as far as this Karen person did with her fake master keys. You folks really did the whole community a service by exposing that operation. As I reflected on the entire experience, I realized that Karen's downfall had been inevitable from the moment she decided to escalate her fraudulent authority claims into actual criminal behavior. Her fake master key scheme might have continued indefinitely if she had been content with intimidating residents and conducting unauthorized inspections. But her decision to call 911 and file false police reports had brought her activities to the attention of law enforcement officers who were trained to recognize fraudulent claims. The dispatcher who had helped coordinate my response to Karen's false 911 call became something of a local hero herself. Dispatcher Williams was recognized by the City Council for her professional handling of the situation and her role in exposing a criminal conspiracy that had been operating in multiple neighborhoods across the county. "We see a lot of neighbor disputes and HOA conflicts," Dispatcher Williams told the local newspaper when she received her commendation. "But this case was different because the suspect was using our emergency services as a weapon against innocent residents. That crosses a line from civil dispute into criminal behavior, and we take that very seriously." The case also led to changes in how the dispatch center handles calls involving HOA disputes and neighbor conflicts. New protocols were implemented to verify the identity and authority of callers who claim to have official business at residential properties, and dispatchers received additional training on recognizing false emergency reports. Karen's master key conspiracy had ultimately affected over 40 properties across 3 different neighborhoods, making it one of the largest residential security fraud cases in the county's history. The investigation took nearly 8 months to complete and resulted in charges against 7 different individuals who had purchased unauthorized key copies from Karen's operation. The locksmith shop that had been Tony's security services was eventually sold to new owners who implemented strict verification procedures for any work involving master key systems or HOA-related lock installations. The new owners also established a policy of requiring written authorization from both individual homeowners and HOA boards before performing any work that could compromise residential security. For my part, I was invited to speak at several community meetings and HOA seminars about recognizing and responding to fraudulent authority claims. My experience with Karen's master key scheme became a case study that was used to educate other homeowners about their rights and the importance of verifying claimed authority before allowing access to their properties. The most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was seeing how the neighborhood had come together to address the problem and prevent similar abuses in the future. What had started as one resident's refusal to be intimidated by fraudulent authority claims had evolved into a community-wide effort to protect everyone's rights and security. In the end, the real master key was knowledge of the law, careful documentation, and the courage to stand up to fraudulent authority figures who rely on intimidation rather than legitimate power to get their way.